This is Behind the Headlines, with behind-the-scenes analysis on issues affecting Pennsylvanians, sponsored by the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. Now, here's your host.
Hi, from Philadelphia to Erie and from Scranton to Pittsburgh, it's Behind the Headlines. I'm Charlie Greenewalt, Senior Fellow of the Susquehanna Valley Center for Public Policy. I'm joined by my co-host Mara Donnelly, as usual. Mara, welcome to the show.
Hello, Charlie.
Why, what's going on in Pennsylvania?
Oh, a lot. New governor, everything's, chugging along here.
And just like everywhere else, we're jumping ahead and looking into the next year and possible presidential races. How does that look to you?
Scary.
I suppose Charlie, that's one way
it's too soon to be worried about it.
There you go. Well, we have one of the best people in the state to talk about the state of Pennsylvania public policy and of legislation in the state capitol, and that is the Senate Majority Leader, Joe Pittman. Senator Pittman, welcome to the show.
Charlie, thanks for having me.
Oh, welcome back. We had you a few, it was about a year ago, I guess.
I think you're right.
Something like that. Yeah. That was a wonderful segment. But you represent the 41st District. You're from Indiana, Pennsylvania, and you represent Armstrong, Indiana, Jefferson, and part of Westmoreland counties, I believe.
That's correct, yes.
So how long have you been in the legislature now?
I was elected to the state senate in June of 2019 in a special election, so almost 4 years.
And to think that you're majority leader in 4 years, you've had one of the most rapid rises to leadership that I've know of. Congratulations.
Well, thank you, but I'm flattered that my colleagues entrusted me in the position, and I view it as very important to do my best to not only represent my constituents in the district that I represent, but also the 27 other members of our Senate Republican majority. And it's an important job, and it's humbling to have the responsibility of the position.
Well, at this time of year, I guess we look to the governor's budget address. The governor has given it, one of the longest budget addresses I remember, and we were wondering what your reaction and what the majority caucus in the Senate's reaction is to the governor's budget proposal.
Obviously, if you had the 253 legislators in the House and the Senate develop their own budget, it would be different. And I view the governor's budget no differently. He's presented us a budget that I think is a good starting point. There are things that I don't particularly like, but that's part of how we get through this process. I give him credit for not throwing things at the wall just to see what sticks, like Governor Wolf was pretty legendary for doing. We're fortunate that we have healthy revenues. April's revenues came in slightly above estimate, which April is the biggest month that we receive revenues. So that was important. I'm concerned what the economic future may be and where our revenues are coming from in the future, because at the end of the day, unlike our friends at the federal government, we have to balance a budget. And so we have to be mindful of what we spend today to make sure we don't get in a difficult situation a few years down the line.
Will the budget be on time?
I don't know.
Favorite question this time of year.
I will answer it with a firm maybe. The Constitution indicates that we should have a budget by June 30th. I will tell you that our caucus wants to meet that deadline. We would love to see us enact a budget early, but we're most focused on making sure it's a responsible product.
Now, I heard some of the members of your caucus say that this budget proposal and budget address was far less ideological than some of the ones that we heard from Governor Wolf. Would you agree with that assessment, and how would you characterize this proposed budget?
I would tend to agree with that assessment for the most part. I think when we look at the divided government that we have here politically, we have obviously a Democratic governor, we have a Senate Republican majority, and at this moment we have a House of Representatives that has a very thin Democrat margin in the majority. And that divided government, I think, leads us to be a little less extreme in some of the positions of the bases of the party. And I believe that the governor has recognized that some of the extreme positions of his political base just are not tenable in this current environment. So I think that's helpful. You know, the voters sent divided government to Harrisburg, but I firmly believe they did not intend to send dysfunctional government. So we have to figure out a way to work together and try to build responsible policy for the Commonwealth.
Divided but not dysfunctional.
Yes.
It's great. So Governor Shapiro has said that he wants to be an economic leader and drive innovation on a global scale. Do you think that's possible? He's done some interesting things lately, so.
I think it's possible. The words are easy to say.
Yeah.
It's a matter of implementation, and I view the biggest challenge that we have beyond some of our tax structure is the bureaucracy. You know, I remember very vividly, I believe it was when U.S. Steel broke ground in Arkansas, the governor of Arkansas made the comment that we turn dirt faster than Pennsylvania issues permits. And I think that that's a very
That's not good.
important, no, and that's an important and salient point. And so the talk about permitting reform and, you know, relieving us of red tape to try to have movement in economic opportunity, I think is very critical. And I appreciate the words on it. The key is going to be action. We need to see the action.
You recently had an announcement out in Westmoreland County that might create 300 jobs. Can you tell us a little bit about that project? I think it's fascinating.
It is a fascinating project. The cities of New Kensington and Arnold in Westmoreland County are part of the district that I represent. And it was a good example of public-private partnership. The state stepped forward with about $19 million of grants and loans. The local foundations, the Mellon Foundation, I believe, put in a significant amount of money. And then we have the private equity that's investing in this project called Rebuild. It's a manufacturing initiative that's going to revitalize the city of New Kensington and Arnold and their manufacturing base. And I think it's one of the dynamics that we have in Pennsylvania. You know, there is the reality of property that has negative value. And the reality is you can't just expect the private sector to take negative value property and repurpose it. And that's where I think our partnerships are very important with the private sector. And this was a good example of it. I think we are way behind Ohio. We are way behind even West Virginia whenever it comes to attracting big investment. At the end of the day, this is a big investment. It's an $81 million investment. And so the way I view it beyond the jobs is the revitalization of the communities.
Well, certainly one of the things that we're concerned of statewide as well as nationwide is energy and energy production. And is it not true that one of the state's biggest coal-fired electricity generating plants in the Commonwealth was recently closed or is scheduled to be closed in your district? And wasn't there some way to save that or to take another look at it?
It's very difficult right now, Charlie, in my district because the Homer City Generating Station is a huge economic engine on multiple levels. Now, it is a plant that's about 60 years old. The technology is older. It has a very difficult time competing with natural gas, particularly with the low price of natural gas. But I'm very concerned between the low price of natural gas, the way the PJM, which manages our power grid, is maintaining our baseload capacity, and of course all of the environmental regulations either in effect or proposed have created this degree of uncertainty where the ownership can't see fit to make the capital investments needed to modernize the plant, to keep it competitive, because they just don't see where the future is in terms of the reliability of our power grid and how we receive our electricity. It's a huge loss to my communities. It's a huge loss to the Commonwealth. And I'm very concerned where we're going in terms of the reliability of our power grid. Shortly after Homer City announced that, there was a natural gas plant proposed in Renovo, Clinton County, a $1 billion investment that was canceled. And so that to me was just as devastating because it's one thing to see things evolve and older technologies be replaced with newer technologies, but what I'm starting to see is the older technologies that fuel our power grid are going offline and they're not being replaced.
Exactly. And it's interesting, the natural gas may be cheaper, but all fossil fuels are under such pressure now, particularly from Washington, without options for replacing them. So what are we left to do at the state level?
You're absolutely right, and this just isn't a state policy problem. This is a national policy dynamic, because what I'm seeing is, for example, West Virginia is investing in their coal-fired power plants. New Jersey's making a move to be completely, quote, renewable in their electricity grid. The problem is we're all interconnected. And so the policies of every state, whenever it comes to our electricity production, impact the others. And that's where I think we've lost our global view of how complex and important it is to maintain this energy independence.
Certainly no one is more green than many of the European governments, but someone threw a cup of water in the faces of many of the government leaders. Poland has committed to building new coal-fired plants. Germany has, as well as the United Kingdom. They have all announced in the last 6 months they're building new coal-fired plants. China is putting a new coal-fired plant online. What is it, one a week at this point?
I believe that's what I've read.
So I'm just wondering where we're going, where are we heading, particularly if we're going to be banning natural gas and natural gas stoves. We can't have gas lawnmowers. I don't know, is there any of those proposals rattling around the state legislature here in Pennsylvania at this point?
Those proposals have rattled around, yes, but we as a Senate caucus will not entertain such nonsensical ideas, and that's the only way to describe them. They're nonsensical. And you bring up Europe. It's an interesting case study, I think, because for all their talk about green, it became very clear whenever Russia invaded the Ukraine that they really weren't that green, because they were relying on Russia's natural resources. And they were basically enabling Putin's thuggery. And when that invasion occurred, they were left to scramble on how they were going to replace what they had to wean themselves off of from Russia. So that, I think, is such an important dynamic. Energy independence is national security. Let's make no mistake about it.
When we had chatted with you last year, we talked about the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, RGGI, affectionately referred to. What's going on? What's the latest on RGGI?
It's in the courts. The Commonwealth Court had hearings on it. They have not yet made a decision. The Supreme Court will be hearing the case on whether or not this is a tax and whether or not it was done constitutionally. Governor Shapiro has certainly raised some fair questions about RGGI, and I'm hopeful that he will see fit to unwind what his predecessor has done. But I'm concerned that the longer he goes without making that move, the more painful it becomes. Because as we talked about with the Homer City Power Plant, when you have this prospect of a tax being implemented on you at any given moment, depending on what the courts rule, your desire to make long-term capital investments goes away. And that's a real problem. And so I view it as stifling investment in our production of electricity in Pennsylvania every day that goes by that the prospect of RGGI exists.
There's a whole new generation of nuclear power plants that have emerged recently, again, particularly in Europe. They're smaller plants. They do not have fuel rods that need to be stored and disposed of in the future. And they look very, very promising. But it is nuclear power, so you have this whole sort of atmosphere about it, which makes it very hard for many American state legislatures to deal with. I don't know, is this a source of energy that has been looked at all here in Harrisburg?
It's been discussed, but the problem is the magnitude of what would have to be built out and how quick to replace any fossil fuel generation. Nuclear energy, I think, has a lot of upsides. There's a lot of positives, but as we see just down the street here with 3 Mile Island, when you go to decommission them, it's a real challenge. I believe the technology has evolved. I'm certainly not an expert at it, but it is a viable path. If the focus is to eliminate the emitting of carbon from the production of electricity, nuclear has to be part of the conversation. But the problem is we are not giving ourselves a runway to make that kind of transition. We're pushing our fossil fuel production off a cliff. We're not putting it on a glide path.
Well, Senator, unfortunately, we're out of time. We haven't even started to talk about education or many other areas of public policy that we want to touch about with you.
Election reform, you'll have to come back.
So you have an invitation,
Well,
an open
thank you.
invitation to come back.
Well, I'm happy to come back. I appreciate the time, and if you ever want to extend it to a marathon session, I'm here at your disposal.
You've heard it here from Senator Pittman, and we look forward to having you back. And we'll be right back after this message.
Behind the Headlines is brought to you as a public service by the Pennsylvania State Association of Township Supervisors, the largest, most influential municipal association in the Commonwealth. Since 1921, PSATS has been preserving and strengthening township government and securing greater visibility and involvement for townships in the state and federal political arenas. Covering 95% of Pennsylvania's land mass, townships represent 5.5 million residents, more than any other type of political subdivision in Pennsylvania. Additional underwriting provided by the Worrell Corporation Foundation, based in Carlisle, Pennsylvania, by the Edward H. and Jeannie Arnold Foundation, and by the Pennsylvania Manufacturers Association. Business in Pennsylvania is our business. Behind the Headlines is also supported as a public service by the Pennsylvania Highway Information Association, the go-to source to learn about transportation projects and issues. Visit pahighwayinfo.org.
Hi, welcome back to Behind the Headlines. On this segment of Behind the Headlines, Mara and I are thrilled to welcome back to the show Charles McElwee. Charles is the editor of Real Clear Pennsylvania, and he's a frequent contributor to City Journal out of New York City. Very, very esteemed and influential publication. So welcome back, Charles.
It's great to be back here.
We rely on you for a lot of good political advice and information, and I think we'd like to start out with what do you think of the first 100 days of Governor Shapiro?
So Governor Shapiro has received praise from both political sides for his leadership in the first 100 days as governor of Pennsylvania. And he has confronted many things so far. I mean, 3 disasters alone. He had to respond to the East Palestine train derailment. He had to respond to the candy factory explosion in West Reading and then the chemical spill in the Delaware River. In addition to that, he has been making efforts to work with the other side in the state legislature, Democrats with the narrow, very narrow majority in the state House, 1 seat, and then a Republican majority in the Senate. And he has been explicit that he wants to engage the other side, and that is even evidenced by the passage of his first bill. He signed into law a breast screening related insurance coverage law that was supported by both sides. The state Senate recently passed a ban on safe injection sites in Pennsylvania. That, of course, will have to go to the House, but as far as we know, Governor Shapiro supports that ban. So he has taken a moderate position, avoided a lot of the national culture war fights, for example, and really made an effort to work with the other side and being an effective governor focused on economic concerns that matter to Pennsylvanians.
So with the first 100 days behind him, I guess you could say his honeymoon period is over. What sort of challenges do you think he faces in the next couple years?
There are wide-ranging challenges in Pennsylvania. A few that come to mind. One is reshoring and manufacturing in Pennsylvania. What is the state of it? This is the state that fueled America's Industrial Revolution, so it only makes sense that we have to make an effort based on our historical legacy to make this a major economic development center, not only in the Mid-Atlantic, but nationally. have been examples of manufacturing success. For example, in Schuylkill County, there was recently the announcement of a semiconductor-related facility, a manufacturer that's the largest of its kind in the world that will be opening there. And in addition to a manufacturer that recently opened in New Kensington. But when you look at the stats, for example, last year, 2022, Pennsylvania reshored 4,500 jobs. That compared to New York and Ohio, which rank first and second. In New York, it was something like 45,000, Ohio 29,000. But when you look at those stats, Pennsylvania remains far behind. So in addition, Shapiro really has to address this national focus, this economic development trend of reshoring. We can't miss that opportunity. The second challenge that I think he faces is the state of Pennsylvania cities. They aren't in good shape. When you look at Pittsburgh, the office vacancy rate is off the charts. There's a public safety crisis in the downtown. It's indisputable. Civic leaders are concerned. You have a high vacancy rate in Philadelphia, and some of this is beyond anyone's control. It's a post-COVID trend of the days of the cubicle office are over. People like to work remotely, but we have to figure out ways to address the gaps are in these cities now, including the state capital. Downtown Harrisburg is in appalling shape when you compare how it once looked 20 years ago during the restaurant row-driven renaissance. It was a thriving downtown. That is no longer the case, and it's driven in large part by the absence of workers. We have 29,000 state workers in the Harrisburg area. Recently, Governor Shapiro called back in management level administrative positions to the city 3 days a week to work in state government. Should that number go up? What will the governor do to work with mayors, including the mayor of Harrisburg or the mayor of Pittsburgh, or whoever the mayor of Philadelphia will be, and mid-sized mayors in addressing what is clearly the trend of decline in downtowns?
There's so much to ask you here, Charlie. One of the things is reshoring. I'm somewhat puzzled why New York would have so much success reshoring jobs when all the rules, regulations, and taxes in New York are so much higher, for example, than many of the other states.
Right, it's the issue of foreign direct investment, because so many of these manufacturers that we see, even beyond Pennsylvania, they're foreign companies investing in manufacturing operations in any given state as a result of the supply chain disruptions that we have come to learn are a consequence of something like a global pandemic, the pitfalls of globalization that had occurred for 30 years. And that was proved detrimental to so many regions, including in Pennsylvania. But it's a challenge, and Shapiro did create an office as part of to streamline the economic development process in Pennsylvania to deal with the regulatory red tape. But navigating the red tape is one thing. I think a question we must ask, what can be eliminated from that process, all those regulatory burdens? And we have seen examples where economic development opportunities have fallen through. For example, this $1 billion proposed natural gas-fired generating plant in Renovo. Renovo is not in good shape, and the mayor knows that too. And as he said, it was a recent interview that project, how it fell through, was devastating to his community. So we have to really ensure that we're working with all stakeholders across the state to really not miss this opportunity. When you look at the Auto Belt, the Sun Belt, states like Nevada, states in the South, we're competing at a nationwide scale for this major opportunity. And that, I think, is an opportunity, but also a challenge for the governor in the term ahead.
So we're going to move on to some election stuff, but before we do, what grade would you give the governor?
I mean, a grade. I would say that's subjective. I mean, A- when you consider everything. I mean, because he's focusing on the job. At a time when national politics is defining the mood, he's focused on actually governing and working with the other side.
Great. I'd take an A-, wouldn't you?
Oh, sure.
Yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the upcoming elections. What do you see happening in the next year or so? And what's most interesting in Pennsylvania? What should everybody be following?
Well,
Paying attention to?
of course, we have the Senate race next year, and
U.S. Senate,
U.S.
yeah.
Senate, Bob Casey will be running for re-election. This will be his fourth re-election, or he won 3 times. This is his 4th time. And as it stands, we'll be looking at likely David McCormick announcing. He recently came out with a book that addresses a lot of the concerns we just talked about: reshoring, manufacturing, economic development, the fight against China. And then we're waiting to hear from Doug Mastriano, who ran for governor against Shapiro last year, lost by 15 points. It was a record-setting loss, something we haven't seen since 1946. And he said he and his wife has made a decision. So if that occurs, and what to watch would be the primary between McCormick and Mastriano. But whoever prevails, I mean, if it's Mastriano, we could very well be looking at an encore performance of what happened to him last year. If it's McCormick, it would be more of a competitive race.
That would be interesting.
Well, it's
Yeah.
interesting because if you remember more on the show a few weeks ago, I think it was Charlie Giroux, and I agreed with him, said that Bob Casey wasn't going to run for re-election. It didn't appear that he was going to at that time, but things seem to have changed, haven't they, Charlie? But interesting, I mean, he's must have just made up his mind because he's raised more money from corporate PACs than he has from people throughout Pennsylvania. I think so far he's raised $70,000 from in this last quarter. He's raised $70,000 from donations from Pennsylvania residents and $75,000 from corporate PAC here in Pennsylvania. So it means he's sort of just, what do you think? He's kind of just entered this and just decided to do it.
Well, that's right, and Republicans face a crisis of the last election cycle and the fact that they clearly have to get their act together, that they have to improve their mail-in ballot efforts among voters. We have about 1 million independent, unaffiliated voters in Pennsylvania in the suburbs. Bring enough of those back into the Republican fold to make statewide candidates competitive for the GOP. So many demographic headwinds, and then you have young voters. In 2014, 14 or 12% of Pennsylvania voters under 30 voted. That shot up to 32% last November.
They were overlooked.
Overlooked
Underestimated.
hugely.
Yeah.
And then we now have so many Hispanic majority small to mid-sized cities east of the Susquehanna engaging that voter demographic. So those are the voting demographic trends to follow next year.
Okay. Again, we're out of time.
It goes by too fast.
And again, we're just getting going. Charlie, will you come back again real soon?
Would love to come back. Thank you so much for having me.
We'd love to have you back. And we'd love to have you back again next week for another episode of Behind the Headlines. We'll see you then.